Hi, I'm Denise, and I'm 35 years old. When I was 8, my mother passed away, leaving my father to raise me on his own. He did his best for about 5 years until, when I was 13, he told me he'd started dating someone. At the time, I didn't think much of it. A year later, he introduced me to his girlfriend, Margaret, and shared that they planned to marry. Margaret's age surprised me. She was only 10 years older than me. While it caught me off guard initially, I eventually grew used to it. Margaret and I didn't connect easily. She often tried too hard to play the role of a mother, which I found overwhelming. I tried talking to my dad about it, but he generally sided with her. Despite this, my relationship with my father stayed strong. We kept our bond alive with bi-weekly lunch dates, even as he gently encouraged me to get closer to Margaret. Over time, he seemed to accept that our relationship would remain distant. In my professional life, I was doing well. I landed a good job right after college, which allowed me to live comfortably, save, and plan for the future. But my world turned upside down when I was 30. My dad passed away suddenly in an accident. His loss was devastating. I struggled to cope, crying myself to sleep most nights and finding it hard to function. Thankfully, my job allowed me to take a week off to grieve. After the funeral, I decided to check in on Margaret. Despite our strained past, I knew how much she'd loved my dad. When we met, her composure surprised me. While I looked utterly broken, with tear-streaked cheeks and sleepless eyes, she seemed calm, too calm. At first, it bothered me, as if I was the only one mourning him. But soon, I realized grief manifests differently for everyone. One evening, we had a heartfelt conversation. Margaret opened up about the emptiness my dad's absence had left in her life, and I saw her grieve for the first time. That moment softened something in me, and we started meeting more often. Over tea, we shared stories about my dad, finding solace in our shared memories. For the first time, I saw Margaret as a person, not just someone who tried to fill a role she didn't fit. Then one day, Margaret broke down during one of our talks. She sobbed uncontrollably, leaving me unsure of how to comfort her. When she finally calmed, she explained that she'd received a foreclosure notice. She had fallen behind on mortgage payments while caring for my dad and handling his medical bills. Now, with no job or savings, she faced the prospect of losing her home. My heart ached for her. My dad had always stressed the importance of saving for emergencies, and I realized I was in a position to help. I assured Margaret we'd figure something out but laid out conditions for my support. First, I'd cover her mortgage temporarily, but I couldn't afford to pay both her mortgage and my rent, so I would need to move in with her. Margaret agreed immediately, calling the house ours rather than just hers. Second, I made it clear this arrangement was temporary. She would need to find a job and start covering her payments. She promised she'd do her part. Within days, I reached out to the bank to negotiate. Margaret had missed 5 months of payments, and with late fees and penalties, the debt had ballooned to $220,000. It was a staggering amount, but I paid it to stop the foreclosure and buy her some time. Margaret was deeply grateful, cooking a lavish meal to show her appreciation, but I reminded her that finding a job needed to be her priority. As we navigated this new chapter, Margaret and I developed a deeper understanding of one another. Supporting her wasn't just about money, it was about honoring my father's memory and the love we both shared for him. Margaret's vulnerability showed me a side of her I hadn't seen before, and slowly, our relationship evolved into something genuine. Moving in with Margaret marked the beginning of a new chapter in both our lives. Adjusting to living together again came with its quirks. Margaret had grown far more particular about cleanliness than I remembered. While I appreciated her efforts to keep the house tidy, conflicts arose when her standards extended to my personal space. I stood firm about the state of my room, emphasizing the need for mutual respect, especially since my financial contributions were what allowed us to maintain this arrangement. Despite the occasional disagreement, cohabitation was manageable, and there were even moments of camaraderie. As weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years, my patience with Margaret's prolonged job search began to wane. She frequently assured me she was looking for work, but I saw no tangible progress. The lack of updates, no interviews, no callbacks, struck me as odd. When I gently raised the issue, she became defensive, insisting she was trying her best. I clarified that my concern was not with her intentions but with the absence of results. A year had passed since she'd promised to find employment, and I suggested she consider part-time work as a stepping stone. Margaret dismissed the idea outright, declaring she would rather face homelessness than take a job she considered beneath her. Her response stung, especially when she invoked my father's memory to guilt me. It felt manipulative and left me questioning her sincerity. Despite my growing frustrations, I continued covering the mortgage. Though Margaret's behavior became increasingly difficult to handle, she began questioning my comings and goings, demanding to know where I was and who I spent time with. At first, I tolerated her intrusions, understanding she might be feeling lonely or insecure, but as her behavior escalated, I had to set firm boundaries, which only deepened the tension between us. Another 2 years passed, and there was still no progress on Margaret's part. Her promises to find a job seemed hollow, and my patience was all but exhausted. I began to doubt whether she had ever been serious about taking responsibility for her share of the arrangement. Living together, once a hopeful arrangement born out of necessity, was now strained to its limits. I made the difficult and controversial decision to look through Margaret's emails. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. In the 3 years since I'd started helping with the mortgage, she had only applied to 2 jobs. I felt utterly betrayed by her dishonesty, especially after all the effort I had put into supporting her. Confronting Margaret about what I'd found and telling her I could no longer continue providing financial assistance led to a heated argument. She reacted defensively, failing to grasp the seriousness of her actions or my growing frustration. That moment marked a turning point, forcing me to reevaluate our living situation and question the sustainability of our arrangement. For 3 years, I had given Margaret everything I could: patience, support, and even guidance as she struggled to get back on her feet. Yet, her reluctance to take real action and her refusal to seek work actively pushed me to confront her. When I asked her to prove she was genuinely trying to find a job, she accused me of invading her privacy. Despite her response, I tried to explain how much our relationship had meant to me, but I also made it clear that I had to focus on my own future. I could no longer justify paying for a home that wasn't part of my long-term plans. Margaret was visibly distressed, and though her upset affected me, I knew I needed space to process my own frustration. During this time, I thought about how I could help Margaret in a way that would allow me to move forward with my life. After some research, I suggested that she consider filing for bankruptcy to manage her mortgage payments. It would provide her with a temporary reprieve and could ease some of her financial strain. Margaret was initially hesitant but eventually agreed, and I committed to helping her navigate the process. The paperwork was complicated, and it took weeks to get everything sorted, but eventually, Margaret was granted a break from her mortgage payments. I urged her to focus on rebuilding her life, but her response, though cold, suggested she believed she could now manage on her own. That realization, about how our relationship had shifted from mutual support to one of dependency, led me to make a difficult decision. The next month, I moved out. I needed to focus on my own personal and professional growth. With time, my finances improved, I earned a promotion, and I began making substantial investments. As the months passed, the distance between Margaret and me grew. We barely spoke, and it became clear that maintaining our connection was becoming increasingly one-sided. While this chapter of my life had been full of challenges, it also taught me the importance of setting boundaries and taking care of my own well-being. Despite everything, I still made a point to check in on Margaret from time to time. She had been important to my dad, and I knew he had loved her deeply, but when I asked how she was doing or whether she had found a job, her responses were dismissive, often telling me it was none of my business. Her coldness stung, but over time, I learned to let it go, choosing instead to focus on the positive changes in my own life. Then, about 6 months after Margaret's bankruptcy relief ended, she showed up at my door, looking completely undone. Her disheveled appearance and visible weight loss were a stark indication that she was going through something severe. Despite having mentally prepared myself to refuse further help, I couldn't ignore her distress and invited her in to talk. Margaret admitted to falling into a deep depression and intense loneliness after I moved out. She expressed regret for pushing me away in moments of anger and explained that her frustration wasn't just with herself, but with my dad as well, blaming him for leaving her in such a vulnerable position. Her struggles were compounded by an ongoing, 5-year-long job search that had yielded no results. Hearing her confess to her loneliness and financial struggles, especially the depletion of the funds my dad had left her, with no family to turn to for support, put me in an incredibly difficult position. While I had resolved not to offer any more financial assistance, seeing her so close to despair, and knowing how much my dad had cared for her, made it hard to hold firm to my decision. I understood all too well the weight of depression and the toll it can take on someone. I was torn between my desire to uphold the boundaries I had set and the empathy I felt for someone in such deep pain. My initial empathy quickly turned into action as I promised Margaret I would help her once more. Her tearful gratitude moved me deeply, reaffirming my belief in offering support to those in need. The very next week, I returned to the bank to deal with the complexities of Margaret's mortgage, which had been left unpaid for 6 months. As I reviewed the situation, I couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't taken steps to adjust her payments to something more manageable. But then I realized, given how overwhelmed she seemed, she probably couldn't even bring herself to face the situation. After going over the details, I discovered Margaret was $992,000 short of fully settling her debt, including late fees. Thankfully, my financial situation had improved considerably over the past 6 years, putting me in a position to cover that sum. I offered to pay off her mortgage outright, with the understanding that she would repay me over time. Margaret was overwhelmed with emotion, promising to pay me back as soon as she could. I planned to formalize the agreement in writing, but somehow, Margaret convinced me to focus on settling her debt first before we worked out any formal contract. After paying off her loan, I went to visit her, expecting a sense of relief and gratitude. Instead, I was greeted by an unsettling scene. An unfamiliar car was parked in the driveway, and inside, I could hear Margaret's laughter mingling with the voice of a man. I walked into the living room, only to find Margaret seated comfortably on another man's lap, an image that felt like a slap in the face. Just a week earlier, she had been grieving my father's loss and speaking about him with such deep affection, and now here she was, so easily moving on. The sight was a sharp contrast to the grief-stricken widow who had convinced me to help her. The ease with which she shifted her affections felt like a betrayal. I realized then that her earlier declarations of love and sadness might have been nothing more than a calculated attempt to manipulate me, playing on my emotional connection to my father to get me to pay off her mortgage. The realization hit me hard when Margaret noticed me standing in the doorway. She casually pointed me out to her companion, laughing as she introduced me in a way that felt dismissive and exploitative. It was in that moment I fully understood the manipulation I had been blind to until then. An unexpected and unsettling visit from Margaret forced me to confront the nature of my support for her and the boundaries I had allowed her to cross. During our conversation, she shamelessly gloated to her companion about how she had skillfully manipulated me into paying off the mortgage for the house, a property she had inherited through my father. Margaret admitted that she had feigned helplessness to secure my financial assistance, revealing her true intentions and lack of genuine affection for my father. Her exploitation of our relationship for financial gain was now undeniable. I stood there, stunned by her callousness, before confronting her about the deceit. To my shock, she showed no remorse. With a smug sense of triumph, she boasted about owning the house and her new life with her boyfriend, completely dismissing the love my father had once shared with her. The betrayal and hurt I felt were overwhelming, and I left her house in tears, vowing not to let her succeed in her manipulation. Fortunately, fate intervened. The bank's policy held large transactions for a day, which gave me a crucial window of time to cancel the payment. Realizing the extent of Margaret's deception, I acted quickly, halting the transaction, severing all contact with her, and ensuring she couldn't reach me again. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret remained unaware of the cancelled payment, living under the false belief that she had secured the house. Meanwhile, I focused on moving forward, both physically and emotionally, finding some peace knowing that the truth would eventually surface. True to my expectations, the mortgage payment was never completed, and the house was eventually foreclosed on. Word of Margaret's situation quickly spread among mutual friends, exposing her true nature to those around her and isolating her further. Her boyfriend left, and she was left without support, income, or a place to live. This painful chapter taught me the harsh realities of human nature and reinforced the importance of guarding my emotions against manipulation. I learned the difficult lesson that not everyone deserves my trust or help, especially those who view kindness as a weakness to exploit. Despite the turmoil, I found strength in knowing I had protected my father's legacy and stood up for myself. While this experience was bitter, it did not leave me bitter. Instead, it empowered me to live a life that honors my father's memory, free from the shadows of the past.